Disaster preparedness and resiliency is something that not everyone really looks at. And as businesses want to grow, like we all want to grow our businesses, we start to think about insurable risk. And while insurance is really important to us, it's not the only thing. How can you possibly insure for a pandemic? Is there insurance policies out there? And even though you have insurance, it's not going to really reduce everything that you're going to feel in the impact of that particular event. So again, we look at fire and flood and feast and famine, but know that business interruption is something that you have to be your own advocate on. And we really encourage businesses to really look at the places to put themselves in the best position to understand how, one, you can reduce the impact, but also look how you can modify your behaviors and your operations and your day-to-day activity in spite of that disruption. And so I want to point to something before I go through the agenda today and indicate that the Travelers has done a survey and found that almost half of the businesses out there operating aren't prepared with any kind of continuity plan. 90 to 95% of those businesses, when interviewed, said they felt that they were prepared. And yet the Small Business Administration says the reality is less than 25% of those businesses aren't, or are rather. So when you start thinking about that, 25% feel they're prepared, but also 25% of those businesses never reopen after a major event. And in your work and in your line of duty, like mine, I'm finding that a lot of businesses are telling us they aren't going to reopen, and there's no future to determine whether they will because of the pandemic. There's a lot of uncertainty. And so events, don't have to be things like hurricanes and tornadoes or even a pandemic. Sometimes it can be a lengthy closure because you have a utility disruption or some kind of criminal activity, or a key player in the business unfortunately gets ill or passes. So during this session today, I'm going to be talking about ways that you can impact any kind of disaster in operations and how to best prepare for that. And I want to focus on actions, again, that are going to help you minimize that disruption, but also look at the safety of your employees and preserve your assets and learn how you can create and test, but also maintain a recovery plan afterwards. Thinking about what you do as an employer and appointing somebody in that position that's a responsible person. In many cases, folks don't really think about that. They don't do it. And so that's really the intention of today, is to think about how you're going to be able to minimize impact. Looking at the variety of potential threats that we have, as I've already outlined, thinking about your supply chain, your employees, your distribution channels, and think about how you would be confronted in the middle of a crisis. If you're looking possibly at disruptions, where do you go for experience? And anybody who's ever had to deal with COVID-19, well, no one's had experience dealing with COVID-19. And in the fall, many experts are predicting that it's going to resurge again, and possibly in November. And so the example I point to there is many universities and colleges are saying they're going to open as business as normal in August, beginning of September, but they're not going to come back after Thanksgiving break because they're anticipating a resurgence of COVID-19. Well, where do they get that from? Well, just like a hurricane, there's predictions that can be made based on weather patterns and what's happening in other parts of the world. So we want to make sure that we stay relevant and current as to what's happening here and now. So what happens after we look at the initial and potential disruptions? Well, the next step is to take into consideration any other kind of interruption that we've identified, but also looking at immediate steps to take. And some of those examples are things like lost sales, employees, some things in that business that you're experiencing right now. And the loss in sales could mean that you're not bringing your employees back. But you might also have employees that are afraid to come back. What if you're not preparing yourself correctly? What kind of regulatory fines would you be incurring? So you've got to be able to think about that in terms of, did I pay all of my car taxes in time? If I have to register a new dump truck, what's Department of Transportation or DOT, or even getting the licenses or the registrations done? Although it's been published that you're supposed to have extensions, are those employees able to process what needs to be done? If you're laying employees off, can Department of Labor accommodate that excess flow? And what we've found is, whether it's restaurants or manual labor in manufacturing, there was such an onslaught, as we know, they couldn't get to everybody within 6 to 10 weeks. And I've used this example a few times, as my daughter was in the restaurant business. She's a chef, and they laid her off. They only needed one chef. And they brought her back 8 weeks later. She never got her unemployment until she was back at work for 2 weeks. Fortunately, she lives at home, but it's those kinds of things that, how do you prepare for that? Even though as the employer, you're filling out the paperwork, your employees are struggling. So increased expenses can occur, your PPE, clearly being able to get those things, loss of data. If somebody's out, what are you doing to get data? How can you track the power outages when you start looking at the efficiencies and costs of manufacturing? Who's able to provide that? We're also noticing customer satisfaction. And I had this conversation lengthy yesterday. There was an early birthday celebration for both me and a couple of my friends that share the same weekend birthdays. And I started saying, you know, there's this thing about banks, and I'm a former banker, and I've noticed that the disruption in customer service has meant a lot of negative things in terms of somebody's being admitted. I just admitted another person. Using COVID as an excuse to not follow through on good customer service, and having a phone call from somebody on your personal phone, and you respond back to them, and then they tell you, well, that's not the way we always do things. You need to call my business line, or you need to email my business line. Remembering that if you're reaching out to customers, making sure that your message is clear and concise, but also making sure that you're trying to be customer centric, even in a downtime where you don't know what the next step is going to be. Providing bad customer service is not where you want you or your employees. It'll damage your reputation. And considering the fact that downtime is going to mean something beyond this particular COVID period. People are starting to open up restaurants or beauty salons or other businesses in retail, and yet we could experience power outages. It could also be a problem getting your utility bills paid or keeping production going. There could be brownouts as we move forward. Well, how do you prepare for that if you're not staying current? What if there's damage to your buildings? We're in a period of social unrest right now, and having people damage the buildings, the machinery, the equipment takes a toll sometimes also on your inventory. How did you plan, or did you plan to minimize that type of impact and that type of risk? And there we go. And so when we look at, let's see, can you guys see these pictures on the right of my screen? Should I move those over? Is that better? When we look at this particular worksheet, I just want to come back to this a couple of times, because as you can see on here, we refer to a chart here to organize based on what type of disaster or what type of disruption. In this one, I use the example of a power outage. Well, what does it do for your production and your communications? What resources are impacted? Is it just your machinery? And I shouldn't say that in a diminishing way, but it could also be your computer systems and your phone. It might be a threat where your employees don't want to come in, like we're dealing with right now with COVID. Well, recovery time might take how long if machinery and production are down? Is it 1 day? Is it 1 week? How long will it take you to get that fixed? And then that impact in terms of your operation and financial costs. This is where the SBDC can come in and work with you. Many business owners know this data. It's just a matter of getting it and structuring it and then putting it on a piece of paper so they can think about what the next steps are and how they would be able to move forward. And if we reflect on this particular page for just a moment, we start thinking about the terms of what EIDL or EIDL and PPP were intended to be used for. And then any kind of cash reserves or bridge loan that you might have gotten. This type of analysis can really help you in terms of where your cash position is right now and where it might be if a disaster or a disruption occurs. And we want to be able to provide that tool for you. And so when we think about the emergency response plan, as we start going through this, keep in mind that they're usually designated to help companies respond to local threats like fires, bombs, earthquakes, and so on. And this time we're really looking at it differently in terms of a pandemic. And once the events occurred, clearly it's over. But this one's lingering. And I think that's where the uncertainty of all of us is coming into play. When we start thinking about how do we reopen, how will that impact our ongoing operations, but also our profitability? Yeah, we can open up our salons and we can open up our dentist offices, and the list goes on with restaurants and others, but we're only able to operate at maybe 50% of normal capacity. So how do we recover? Where does it begin? Where does it unfold? A pandemic, again, is not an isolated event. It's going to continue to go on and it's going to continue to unfold. So when we look at air travel, that's going to impact your supply chain. And many cities around the world start looking at dealing with this simultaneously. And that's what we've dealt with clearly historically with China not being able to get us a lot of the supplies. But again, if your supply chain's in another part of the world, you could be impacted by that as well. I have a client who's working with Brazil. They've been severely impacted in South America and particularly in Brazil. So again, we're caught off guard, but we've got to think about putting ourselves in a better place and reducing that risk. And so when we look at this chart, when we start to think about the pandemic alerts, are we giving enough credibility to the World Health Organization, the CDC, OSHA, and those recommendations that are being made there? And are we utilizing the recommendations through our trade associations to think about human-to-human transmission? And we start thinking about all that different significance in terms of longer term strategies. We're starting phase 2 of rollout this week and next with a lot of businesses. And are they ready? I think some folks are reconsidering that this week because of what's happening in Florida and Texas and some other states where when they reopened, infection rates went up and hospitalizations went up. Does that mean, though, that we should be living in fear? No. And as I'm vacillating back and forth between reopening challenges versus not reopening challenges, understand that this is our new normal, and we've got to be able to take that in stride in some way and look at how we prepare for the next normal. And so putting that plan in place and educating your employees and designating somebody to focus in particular areas is going to be very, very important for us. So if we look at here, the company, clearly you can utilize this, the date of implementation, and then what types of policies or procedures need to be in place. Who's going to be the one that takes the information from the owner and the CDC of the business and takes that and translates it into day-to-day policies and procedures? We have John Doe, Sam Doe, and whoever else on the sheet. But again, being proactive in diminishing or reducing the public fear that's following any types of strict procedures and looking at how we can move through the supply chain, customers, any kind of stakeholders that would want to be able to communicate with. So do you have a communications plan? And I think that communication plans are critical for coordinating anything that you say or do between employees, with your distributors and customers and any other types of business personnel. I think when we look at that and communicate to all the business contacts, there are going to be specific questions, and trying to understand what those questions are and adding to the list to preserve the image of the business, but also to preserve the idea that we want to make sure that we're not just talking about it, that we're doing it and we're demonstrating it, and then talking about how we can demonstrate their safety. Good signage is really important there. Planning how to reach out to everybody and tailor each message to a specific need of that particular audience. Your employees are going to feel very different than your customers are, but you want them to be on the same page in terms of transparency. Have your employees change their gloves in front of the customer so the customer knows, for example, they're putting new PPE on. I went and got my hair cut the other day, and the minute I walked into the salon, I was able to put sanitizer on my hands. They gave me a mask. They showed me that they were changing their gloves. They changed the capes. It puts the person's mind at ease. And before I sat down, they cleaned the chair off, even though they had cleaned it before I even got there. When I leave, they clean it again. I think those types of things are examples that are good examples for best practices and good behavior in making sure everybody's on the same page. And I think, again, staying up to date as procedures changed. I know dentist offices, for example, were talking about having a half an hour break in between each patient so that the sanitizers and the sterilization process could take true effect. But knowing when I go into the dentist office that there's not going to be a patient passing me on the way out, I think would be equally important. So while we're in the middle of COVID-19, keep in mind some businesses are essential businesses. And what does that mean in terms of them having to operate? Some of them might have to temporarily shut down. But if you're open, you want to make sure that everybody in your supply chain is also communicated with. What time are those deliveries supposed to be made? And how will you be protecting those particular customers? But making sure that you're tracking this and documenting it, because we might get better over the summer and then regress rather again in the fall. And if we regress again, rather than recreate the wheel all over again, keep that template handy so that you can learn and update it, but keeping communications where you can reroute supply chains. You can find a couple of different suppliers. If your supply chain, for example, you're a restaurant, I have 2 restaurants that have done this. When the truck gets to, there to do the delivery, they eliminated one of the doorways so that it's a one-directional flow. And when the delivery gets done, they don't have to walk the whole way through the restaurant to get there. They actually drop the product right at the door, and it gets signed for right at the door. I think those types of accommodations can be made. And as I outlined here on the slide, keeping that crisis management team phone numbers, if something goes wrong, making sure you've got everybody's phone number and you let them know what the chain of command is. Years ago, we had a policy in banking when I was there that the manager would call the assistant manager and each of them would divide the tasks up to call the staff. If you have a long staff, a long list of staff, have person A call person B, and at the very end, that last person calls the manager, so the manager knows everybody has the information. Making sure there's alternate numbers, getting their email, communicating things out electronically are far better than the old-fashioned phone tag or texting can work as well, but making sure it's a consistent message. And then making sure that you've got family phone numbers. If someone gets sick at your place of business or they get injured, making sure all that information is up to date. Who's the point of contact? What numbers can you reach them at and under what circumstances? Keeping that up to date on a quarterly basis or an annual basis, if there's any changes, just reminding the employees that, again, you're there to help them, but they've got to stay in communication with you. As we move to the next slide, here's the chart that I was talking about earlier in terms of putting together the continuity plan. And as I was talking earlier about suppliers, you can see the slide in the background is the disaster one that referred to the power outage. Well, that transfers to the next one. Who are the suppliers? What types of resources do they provide? And what might be the impact? If you're getting food from a dairy or a farm in general, and then you're getting your supplies from someplace that gets the plates made in the US, and then you might have other items that come in from a foreign country. You want to list those individually and talk about the potential threats that they might have. And the example they use here is being in California. They're faced with wildfires and landslides and mudslides constantly. And again, weather is changing, but it's again being able to recognize on a scale of 1 to 10, what's the probability that you will be impacted and how severe that impact would be. And in this case, we use the example that it would be a 3 out of 10, the probability of happening, but the impact would be a 5. And then where's your backup plan? Where's that going to go? If you're in the food and beverage industry, this might be a little bit different for you. You might be able to use Cisco, or you might have another direct from farm vendor. Keep those things in mind. We've been doing this a lot with our restaurants, and what we're finding is we don't have just a backup plan. We have a B and a C backup plan as well. You might not be able to get things locally. You might have to go outside the state, or if you're already out beside the state, where do you find that supply chain internally? I don't know if anybody has any questions, but I wanted to skip out of this for a second to show you something, and I apologize. I don't want to get anybody nauseous, but I do want to go into our website. And the reason I do this is here under the COVID-19 Resource Center and under our Prepare CT, there are a number of tools that go into far more detail than what I've provided for you. And there is a class that you can take as well, and you can become certified for your business. You can have your employees take it as well. It takes about 30 minutes. Some people go a lot deeper into it. It might take another 30 minutes on top of that. It might be an hour. But here you can see that the post-disaster checklist is provided. You can download that checklist. We also have a cybersecurity one up here. And then we have what we call the disruption one. This is the course that you can take for any kind of disaster or business preparation and disruption. And then we also have the disaster recovery toolkit for all small businesses. Again, it goes into a lot more detail than what I shared with you today. The courses take 30 to 60 minutes. I didn't want to cover that because I wanted to stimulate questions to see if we can pick up on this and move forward to help you plan and recover. Has everyone seen the reopening? I'm assuming that you have. When you look at reopening by business sector, we have all of those on the website as well. We're intentionally doing this to be a clearinghouse for accurate, up-to-date information. So if you or other businesses need additional assistance, in addition to what Jim is providing through the town and Adam through the chamber, please utilize these resources. We've tried to keep them direct from the state. And anytime there's any kind of update from the SBA, we put that here. Any kind of tutorials or webinars we're posting on here as well. You can see there's a few on here. And then looking at the guide, it's an extensive guide on EIDL, PPP, bridge loan, and a variety of other types of business response funding that you would need. So in light of that, I wanted to pause and see if there were any questions or comments, and we can go from there. What are your thoughts?
I have stuck the URL for the SBDC's COVID-19 Resource Center into the chat, so you can just click that link.
Excellent.
Denise, this is Jim. I was curious as to what you've heard. You mentioned that some businesses are not talking about returning. What are they? What are their issues? What is it? Were they not doing well beforehand, and this is the final straw, or is it that they can't find a way to move forward?
It's a little bit of both. I have found that how can you prepare for a disaster when, you know, all these years we've been saying keep 3 to 6 months worth of reserves on hand so that you can get through this. Well, a lot of these businesses have been struggling since February, March. They've depleted their funds. They don't have it. The second part of it is the uncertainty of customers being able to come in. And I'll point to the ones that just reopened, like the beauty salons and barbershops. It was, okay, we're ready to go. And there was a huge list of precaution they needed to take. They couldn't get PPE. Some of these folks applied for EIDL and PPP funding, and they didn't get it, so they couldn't afford to open. The manner in which the funding came out was learn as we go, and the bottleneck of applications and processing was such that they couldn't get funding. And then we tried to reopen and we pulled the date back and changed it. And there's not a clear, consistent direction in some of these areas, not all of them. So it's a combination of a lot of things. Uncertainty has been a real big part of it. Supply chain has been a big part in food and beverage. It's been a part of it in terms of distribution channels. I have some construction companies that were trying to get out there and do construction, and they weren't allowed to. One gentleman goes into New York and over the border in Massachusetts, does construction work. People in those areas called the police and they got shut down, even though there weren't any restrictions on open construction. They had masks, they had the 6-foot, personal space abided by, and they still got shut down. They had to wait. Others are hampered by their pivoting. And instead of doing large construction projects, they needed to get a smaller vehicle, and they couldn't get it registered at Department of Transportation. So it's been all over. And I think part of that, Jim, a great question, is because people aren't working in their offices. They're working remotely, and they're finding new processes in which they're having to get things up and running. And then the bottleneck of being there. And imagine, if you will, my kids are grown. They're 22 and 25. Having small kids where you're trying to get them through school at the same time you're working, that's a real challenge. Thank goodness school ends this week and next, I think, for most schools. So a lot of those parents feel they can focus a little bit better. Summer camps are not going to be opening in many cases. Some may be opening. So again, there's that whole process of uncertainty and transition. I hope that addressed your question.
It did. Thank you.
Other questions? I'm curious about Shannon. I see that, you mentioned earlier that you wouldn't be opening, and I wanted to make sure that I got, the gist of it. Is it because you're all working so effectively at home, or are there other reasons that your business might not be reopening?
I guess, because we're working effectively at home, eventually we're going to go back into the office. I just don't have any set plans. I mean, it's a very small office, and we don't really have any way of, changing, ventilation. We can't open windows. Some people sit pretty close to each other. And I think it's, to have people be on the phone all day and, wear a mask, it's just easier to be at home right now.
Do you feel that in the next 3 to 6 months, you may reopen the office and bring some limited employees back, or not at all for a while?
Yeah, no, within 3 to 6 months, I would guess. Yes. Yeah.
So in light of that, what do you think will be different when you return to the office? Do you think you'll have different procedures in place for ventilation or cleaning and sterilizing the environment? Have you thought that through or talked about it?
A little bit, not too much, but yes, for sure. We definitely would have some sanitizing protocol. I would guess that we would probably still keep the doors, locked and the appointment only, to control people walking in.
Right. What do you think will relieve some of that concern? And I know Sarah and Steve are on the call as well. Do you think having more testing and
Yes.
more information flowing will help?
Yeah, widespread testing, I think, is kind of the answer to all of my concerns, and especially with the kids and schools and camp, and yes, testing is the answer.
What's that?
Testing, I think, is the answer to many things right now.
So does it feel like you're all still in that mode where I'm not ready to be able to move into implementing and minimizing impact? Or when do you think that would take place for your business? Do you think you would start working on that once the reality became, okay, in the next 3 to 6 weeks, we're going to end up going back to work? Or do you think that implementing some kind of plan now would be helpful?
Probably the first part of what you said will be more of I don't feel like I can plan anything that's more than a couple months away at this point. Things just seem to constantly be changing. And also as things open up, I think we're going to see some pocketed outbreaks. And so I just, I want people to be healthy and continue to be able to work.
That makes sense. Steve, how about you? What are your thoughts in terms of getting back into the swing of normal operations, if there is such a definition for you at this point?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've been pretty busy, so I haven't really closed down in terms of my workload. So I've been pretty busy. A lot of my in-person training shifted to webinars. So I've been pretty busy, and a lot of my client work is remote. So I was able to shift my in-person on-site work to remote. So kind of been mostly on path at the moment, on course.
Okay. Are you a one-person operation, or do you have others that work with you?
I work by myself. I have associates I bring in, mostly 1099s as needed.
Okay. And so when you get back together, how do you feel about putting together, the analysis now versus waiting until you have more certainty of where your world's going to unfold in, say, the next weeks, months? What are your thoughts about implementing a plan and a strategy now?
That's a good question. I'm straddling the fence. As one day I think I have enough information to move forward, and then something else will come out and put me in a holding pattern again. So we do have a simple strategy over the next 30 to 45 days, but as you know, things can change at a moment's notice. So I'm staying very flexible at the moment.
That makes sense. It does. And I'm going to come full circle after I talk to Sarah. Are you a one-person operation, or do you work very similar to Steve?
Very similar to Steve. Just one person. Well, actually, pretty much strictly one person. Work in conjunction with some other folks who are remote as well. But for the most part, the guts of my business has really not been impacted that much. Simply because I was already working remotely anyway.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think, in my terms of talking with folks that are one-person shops and they have a lot of 1099s, and I think even if you have 5 to 10 employees in that area, your processes are going to be very different. And so when I think about implementing the plan and looking at the analysis, it's really thinking about who it is that you serve and who you serve with. So instead of employees, you have consultants or subcontractors that you work with. And so when you have the luxury, and I'm putting that word luxury in air quotes because it can have its challenges too, working remotely and virtually. But when you're able to do that, we still want to make sure that they're safe, because if they get sick or get hurt in some way, it could potentially damage your ability. And again, still having a plan B in place. Most of us who work as individuals will have a plan B. And I'll use an example that one of my subcontractors sometimes will look at let me say it this way. One of the subcontractors that we work with at the SBDC has subs that work for them. And they want to have not just 1 or 2 of them doing website design. They sometimes want to have 3 or 4 of them for that very reason, because if you have an influx of a lot of business, you don't have to get everything into a pipeline and it doesn't bottleneck. And in times like now where there's a lot of uncertainty, we want to keep that same plan in place so that if somebody does get sick or drops out or there's something odd that occurs, you still have a plan B and a plan C. But looking at the analysis when you're an individual like you are, it's being able to think about what that impact would be if they can't do the project for you. How much money would you miss out on? And if you think about both Sarah and Steve and maybe even Shannon, what's the average revenue on a basic contract with you or a basic customer? And if you lose that in some way, that's going to leave an impact to your bottom line. When already business is down 50%, you can't afford to lose any more business. Restaurants are going through that right now too. How do I get my people to, or my customers to come back and sit in my restaurant when we can barely get them served outside? We're trying to bring staff back and we're about 50% of staffing capacity, but we're also less than 50% of customer capacity. So balancing all those things out and trying to figure out how you're going to open it when there's no certain deadline, or officially the hurricane is over, officially the fire is over, we can clean up the streets, we can get the building rebuilt. This pandemic's going to be around for a long time, and it's going to keep going through cycles. So what happens is, again, as I joked earlier, is we're planning for a new normal when we're working in the new normal, but we're trying to plan for the next normal because it's going to continue to pivot and continue to change. And that's really one of the reasons I wanted to reach out and indicate that it's not abnormal to feel stressed or concerned, or I just can't get motivated to think through that when I know it's going to continue to pivot and continue to change. That can be time consuming and costly if you spend a lot of energy on it. I'm going to ask one last question. How did everybody do in terms of comfort level in getting your entire organization? And again, if you're one person, you can kind of do this a little bit better than somebody else, but pivoting totally to virtual kinds of communication. Were there any glitches? Were there challenges with, say, IT, with getting people's capacity up to speed? How did that go for everybody?
Pass.
How so?
I didn't have to make a lot of changes.
Yep.
Yeah.
How about you, Shannon?
Yeah, no, we were almost like we were set up like this. We knew this was going to happen. Yeah, I mean, it was easy. You know, maybe 2 hours of little extra back end work. But yeah.
Was that the case for everybody that you were working with in terms of the other side of that formula for customers?
Yeah, you know, like our phones are forwarded to our cell phones. So most people don't even realize that we're not in the office. And we had tons of stuff already, service automation already automated. So
yep. Let me share, we had a couple of questions, a couple of challenges in regard to what we do. Some of our clients are accustomed to meeting face-to-face, and they did not have the bandwidth. They were using a cell phone rather than a computer. They didn't have the bandwidth, so they had children who were on their computers going to school. And we really had to work through the idea of, is it Zoom? Is it WebEx? Is it Skype? Which vehicle will you be able to communicate with us on? And what we found is it was a whole process of educating them. I think most of us are through that now. It happened pretty quickly because you can't stop working and you can't stop producing. But we had a lot of challenges with that, and it was a real education. I mean, if you thought about yourselves, some of us will and some of us won't. Do you know what goes into your bundle in terms of telephone, internet, and TV? And they didn't realize what bandwidth was. I mean, it was a real process with some of those folks. Other ones just got it. It was smooth. It was seamless. But having, say, 2 meg versus 50 meg capability versus 90 meg, that made a difference when you had 4 people on laptops, 2 more on cell phones, and somebody else watching a movie, and you can't get your business done. So we had those kinds of challenges with technology. That's a couple of examples that I wanted to cover today. I wanted to leave it very open to see. And, you know, again, it was a small group, so it was more one-on-one. What questions do you all have for me? What are your challenges specifically that you thought maybe Resiliency could address?
For me, it's just having no clue, as Shannon averred earlier, about what the world will be like in 3 months, in 4 months, in 6 months, and being able to plan, you know, from the Chamber's perspective, events, and what, you know, how far ahead do we decide whether something is going to be virtual or has to be reimagined, or to go ahead and with a live event in the fall or winter. The uncertainty and the guesswork is for me, it's the roughest part.
I would agree. I think we're all in that same boat, whether it's personally or through a business. And I don't think any of us want to live in fear, but I think that that's going to be a challenge for all of us. And I don't think there's any way that we can predict. It's I'm giving you a few tools to put out there to start that process, start thinking, and as things change, continue to modify, continue to answer those. I'd invite you to go to our webpage. Again, I shared some of that information on there. I think it's really important to try something about planning and putting yourself at ease. World news sometimes makes me ill because I think the sensationalism on there, I like to be very data driven, very factual driven. And I just don't want to get wrapped up into all the hoopla of, oh, it's got to sizzle in order for me to get my attention. So I think that's adding to our anxiety, but I think root it right now in following the trend of what's happening elsewhere. Many other countries, including the United States, are really thinking through areas that we might be able to reopen, but do that very gradually and do it knowing science and caution. Safety is the number one reason that we would be reopening, and if and how we reopen. I don't have that. I wish I had that crystal ball. I just don't have it. I think Steve has it. He has the crystal ball.
Use the cue ball.
The cue ball. Yeah, that's true.
Too funny. So again, there are a couple of tools. I just wanted to make sure I wanted to open up a dialogue. Too bad the group wasn't a bigger group. I think, when we have sole proprietors like, Sarah and Steve, it's important to understand how they're dealing with it. The other side of this too is both of you probably work with larger companies in some part of your supply chain, or you are a supplier for larger companies. We're hoping to put together a series of workshops with the Metro Hartford Alliance in the next couple of months to look specifically at that challenge. Larger vendors, or larger suppliers, I should say, larger companies are having a real challenge keeping their supply chain open, and their smaller vendors, because they depend on them in many ways. We want to open that dialogue. Would that be something that would be beneficial for your participation as well, if we put a panel together and address that?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, there used to be a supplier, an equity supplier vendor. I believe it was either down in the Stamford area or the southern part of the state, and they've kind of been dissolved for now. And I think it's partly because of COVID. Everyone's kind of going different directions. But I think IBM was part of it, possibly Pitney Bowes and some others. And if you think about Pratt & Whitney and some of the other larger ones in the major industries we have here, like insurance and financial services, aerospace, and so on, those are large companies. But again, their supply chain with manufacturing and services like you all offer, they're really hurting to keep communications open right now and activity. So with that, I don't want to keep rambling on. We've got another 4 minutes. Adam, I didn't know if you had anything that you wanted to cover, or Jim, or if there were questions from Sarah or Steve.
I have nothing else to cover. Thank you for being with us today. Any questions or anything else from anyone?
No, I guess not.
Thank you.
All right. We'll catch up to you guys the next time. Take care.
Thanks,
Thank
Denise.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.